During our skirmish event at Gongai Games here in Portland, I had a really fascinating scenario arise in one of the top cut games. The card interactions were extremely straightforward, but from a rules policy standpoint, who owned the trigger and who was responsible for the trigger most certainly was not. Now, as the TO and the judge for the event, I had to make a decision. So today I'll explain the situation, the decision that I made, and why, now that time has passed, I think it may have actually been the wrong decision with how we've been told Fab should be played. A huge shout out to our channel members for supporting what we do here. If you want to get involved with the channel and the Dice Commando community, please consider joining as a channel member. Remember, these videos are only possible with your support. You can show that support with a like, a subscribe, and by leaving us a comment and sharing your feedback. Community first, and go Commando. Sometimes in these games, we run into situations that put us at a crossroads. What is the right thing to do versus what is the correct thing to do? And at our recent Blitz skirmish event, I ran into such a situation. Now, while I think my decision was the right thing to do in the moment, now that I've had a week or so removed from it, I think I actually may not have been correct in my actions. Now, the context around today's discussion is, remember, we've been told repeatedly by LSS that they believe players own and are responsible for their own triggers. This has been largely based upon the quite reasonable argument that players should not be responsible for knowing all cards within their opponent's deck. While it remains true that both players are responsible for maintaining game state, the expectation, especially in an ever-expanding and non-rotating card pool that exists in different languages, is that you know and are responsible for your own cards. This was first demonstrated in late 2023 during the UK Pummelgate incident, and then strongly reinforced in early 2025 when LSS doubled down on that policy that they want players to own and be responsible for their own triggers, regardless of what card it is. And this is where our in-game situation, well, it got a little murky. Player A on Aurora was attacking Player B on Florian with Exude Confidence, with an embodiment of lightning on the table. Exude Confidence is a great little card, 0 for 4 with an awesome ability. While Exude Confidence isn't defended by a card with equal or greater power, the defending hero can't play or activate instance or defense reactions as combat chain. The implications of this coming in with Go Again, due to the embodiment of lightning, are potentially significant. No instance or reactions until the combat chain closes, assuming of course it's not defended by a card with greater attack. Now, after the attack was declared and resolved, player B thought it over and then defended with a 9th blade of the Blood Oath, well exceeding Exude's attack and effectively turning off the ability. Reactions were passed and 1 damage was taken, moving us on to the next link. Now, admittedly, I don't remember 100% what the next link was. I believe it was Second Strike, but luckily that's not completely relevant, so that's what we'll go ahead with and use in this example. What matters for the discussion is that, with 0 doubts, Exude was turned off. Now, the card interactions here are extremely straightforward, but what happened next, at least for me, is not. The Aurora player had attacked with their next attack, in this case represented by Second Strike, and the Florian player was considering the responses. And as they were doing so, they said out loud, "So no reactions, huh?" Now, whether they said it to the opponent, to themselves out loud, or just into the aether, it wasn't clear. But the Aurora player stayed quiet and didn't correct them. Now, as the TO standing there, I waited for what I felt was several seconds, certainly long enough to confirm that the Aurora player wasn't going to correct them, and then stepped in and clarified, "You are blocking Exude with a higher attack, and that effect is off." So my friends, that is the situation at hand. And for the rest of today's video, I want to talk about 2 aspects of this. First, triggers and the responsibility thereof. And second, my decision to intervene and whether it was or wasn't warranted. And then finally, I want to discuss the implications of the rules policy and what it means in terms of what is right, what is correct, and ultimately who we really want to be as a flesh and blood community. But before we get into the discussion, let me know in the comments. What would you have done as the Aurora player? And if you were me, would you have intervened? Now, in terms of the situation at hand, the question really distills down to this. Was it the Aurora player's responsibility to correct the Florian player? Now, before you go all ham on the keyboard, let's consider the nuance of the situation, because it really boils down to the Florian player's verbal statement, right? Because if the Florian player hadn't said anything, regardless of what they had in their hand, dereact instant, or whatever, the Aurora player would have had 0 responsibility for one not being played, as they would obviously have 0 hand knowledge. Meaning, if Florian had the wrong understanding of what Exude did, which, to be fair, I'd certainly argue that based on their question, they had signaled to the opponent that they understood the card, at least in concept. But again, even if Florian did understand it wrong, in a vacuum, it's only Aurora's job to make sure that Exude's condition isn't violated, and not the other way around. After all, at least to my knowledge, nothing requires a player of Exude Confidence to say, this is now defended by a card with higher attack, and thus the effect is off. That is certainly not a rule, at least to my knowledge. Because, again, if we flip the roles here, the Aurora player is unquestioningly responsible for ensuring that no reactions are played against Exude Confidence. If a player were to do so and it was missed, under the current rules policy and enforcement, it would be considered a missed trigger on the Aurora player's part. So for certain, in an analogous situation where the Florian player hadn't defended with Ninth Blade and Exude was on, if Florian later tried to defend with a D-React, it would unquestionably be the Aurora player's responsibility to call it out. Otherwise, we'd say, yep, Aurora, they missed the trigger. But that's where things start to get convoluted, right? Because, in fact, after I made my ruling, the Aurora player said to me, yeah, I wasn't sure if I was supposed to say anything or not. And I actually think that's a pretty fair statement and a pretty good summary of the situation. We know who owns the trigger, but who is responsible for it, and what is the responsibility of enforcement? And that's why ultimately, as a judge, I think probably I may have made the wrong decision in the moment. Barring the verbal cue, the Aurora player can't really be held responsible for Florian not playing a D-React that they otherwise could have. And in some edge cases, even if Aurora did know what was in Florian's hand, is it really then Aurora's job to tell Florian that they can play it? I don't believe anyone would have that expectation, right? So in essence, Exude being turned off effectively becomes the Florian player's owned trigger, even though it's Aurora's card. Which again, based on the LSS argument for the basis of the rules policy, they don't expect players to be required to know opponents' cards. Hence, this is why I come to the odd conclusion that this actually all root causes down to the Florian player's verbal statement, right? Without it, there would have been zero responsibility on the part of the Aurora player, which then leads to the question, was it the Aurora player's responsibility to correct that statement? And this is where the conversation, and obviously the reason for this video, really begins. While the right thing to do may have been one thing, the correct thing to do in this case was likely very, very different. Now, my personal opinion on this is that morally, we own ensuring our opponent fully understands, and we own playing the cleanest and truest game possible. But that is my personal opinion, and not necessarily my role as a judge or as a TO. Furthermore, let's be honest, my personal opinion is kind of irrelevant, because not only has LSS clearly defined their vision, but they've actually reinforced it. And honestly, and I do truly mean this, from a purely competitive first rules enforcement perspective, I actually kind of get it. While I don't agree in the truest sense, there's a lot of validity in their approach. It's not the way I choose to play the game or the way I want to win. But from a rules policy standpoint that has to stand as a catch-all, I do understand their position. Additionally, my role as a judge and TO is independent of my personal opinion. Because referencing Pummelgate, both the first one and the second one, it's quite reasonable to assume that every Flesh and Blood player at a Tier 4 tournament knows what Pummel does. But still, trigger enforcement is required by the card owner. If they don't explicitly state it, miss trigger opportunity. But now, let's amp it up just a little bit to give better analogy to the Exude Confidence situation. Let's say on a Pummel trigger, the player taking damage fans out their hand and offers it to the opponent, effectively indicating, you choose my discard. Pummel, of course, allows the defending player to choose the discard. It's not random, as would be implemented by such an action as letting your opponent choose an unknown card from your hand. So in this theoretical situation, is it the owner of Pummel's responsibility to remind their opponent that it's their choice of discard? I, of course, would say yes, but I'm wrong about a lot. Because I'd wager you a whole agility token that in this situation, many competitive players would absolutely pick a card from their hand, not saying anything, and move on as fast as humanly possible. Does it seem like a bit of a double standard in terms of triggers, ownership, and enforcement? To me, it certainly does, but it is what it is. Now, let's head into the next part, which is a review of my decision in that time on that day, and yes, why now I believe it may have been incorrect. First and foremost, right, as a judge, I always believe in a non-interference policy. The primary reason for this is that one of a judge's main responsibilities is that of fairness and equity. Intervening, even for the right reasons, can often cause an imbalance in the fairness of the game. So, as a rule, I try to only interject when specifically called or when I see an egregious rules violation that causes distinct advantage. So, for this situation in the moment, I believe that the Aurora player not correcting the Florian player was incorrect, as they were not properly representing the game state. However, for the reasons we just discussed in detail, I now believe that my decision to intervene was probably not correct. But here's the rub, my friends. I don't believe it was the wrong thing to do from a morality and a fair play standpoint. But remember, my role as judge is not about that, it's about the rules and rules policy enforcement. The right thing to do was for Aurora to clarify the situation to Florian. But in the world of Flesh and Blood, the correct thing was to let it play out. So I'll let the rules lawyers and you all fight in the comment section and hash out the detail of who owns what and who missed or didn't miss and so on. But I acknowledge that I very likely did the wrong thing as Judge NTO in that space at that time. And that, my dear friends, brings us to the final part of today's discussion, because I'm asking you a larger question. Who do we want to be? Now, I want to be clear, I'm not here to rehash Pummelgate 2023, and I'm not even really going to summarize it. If you need to know what happened, want to know what happened, John Warden, aka Fluke and Box, did a pretty great and blunt video about the situation, and I'd encourage you to watch that if you need it all caught up, and I will link it here. Even though I had pretty strong opinions on the matter at the time, I stayed quiet about Pummelgate. There was just no real point in commenting on it at the time, and besides, LSS released their stance on it, and it was what it was. It's not necessarily what I would have liked to see, and I also thought that the direct response by the judge team was subpar, and maybe even encouraged sharking a bit. But, as I mentioned, I understand why their policy has to be such that it is. My true disappointment, rather, was with the larger community. We all know, of course we do, that there are people who will cheat or push the limits as close to the line as possible to get what they want. It's a reality of our life, and no, it is not specific to TCGs. Believe me, I have all sorts of stories about my younger days as a referee in basketball and football. It's an unfortunate reality of any competition, even for basically no prizing, that people will compromise their morals to accomplish victory, whatever it means or whatever the rewards. But in the Pummelgate scenario, what struck me instead was the community's reaction. And frankly, for some, it disgusted me. In fact, there are 2 content creators out there whom I used to not only subscribe to, but used to watch basically daily, whom I really don't any longer, based on their statements during 2023 Pummelgate. Now, to be clear here, I wasn't bothered as much by the fact that people will angle shoot or cheat to reach their goals. That I accept as an unfortunate reality of the world. What I was bothered by, actually, were the statements by many in the community to the effect of, I wouldn't do that at an armory, but at Worlds, you bet I would. So to better explain my position on that, I'd like to tell just a super quick story, one which many of my UK friends will be very familiar with, as it was a favorite joke of Winston Churchill. A gentleman walks into a bar and walks up to a beautiful woman. He asks her if she would spend the night with him for 10,000. She thinks about it for a second and says that she would. The man then asks her if she would spend the night with him for 100. Disgusted, she declares, "What kind of woman do you think I am?" He replies, "We've already established that, ma'am. Now we're just negotiating price." And yes, that joke may be a little silly in concept, but the obvious analogy here is that saying, "Well, I wouldn't do that in an armory," is effectively saying, "Well, I wouldn't do that when the stakes are low," which, my friends, means that you also have a price. It also means that you know what's right and what's wrong, but when it comes to cardboard glory, well, decisions are made. Now, we can all agree it would be really nice if Flesh and Blood tried to set itself apart when it came to this, but it is what it is, and decisions have been made. And that means it's up to each one of us. If you'd angle shoot at a tier 3 but not a tier 1, well, we've already established what kind of person you are. Now, we're just haggling over how many gold foils it's worth it to you. And how many friends in the actual Flesh and Blood, you're willing to lose along the way. Thanks for joining me, my friends. And go Commando.